Uh, Welcome, many of you, once again to our library lecture series. This is the third on our installment for this fall. This is, as you well know, sponsored by the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. We do something like this every October, each Thursday in October, these evenings at the library lecture series. This year, obviously, our theme has been climate change and social justice. Last year was artificial intelligence. Years before that was time. So there's a big topic of what we hope is broad interest that we bring downtown and try to get people coming. If you enjoy your time here, please tell your friends. We have one more of these lectures for this year coming next Thursday, same time, same place. And then, excuse me, one more this year. And then next year, I don't know what the topic is yet, but it should be great. And so, yeah, please keep us in mind when you have a free Thursday in October. Without further ado, this is Bipasha. She gave our most recent lecture, and she's here to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thanks, Mike. I'm a professor at Western, Bipasha Barua, and I'm introducing Pablo. Pablo Bose is a migration and urban studies scholar, professor in the Department of Geography and Geosciences, and the director of Global and Regional Studies at the University of Vermont. And I believe you're also the Associate Dean of Research right now, so that's a lot of work. His main research projects currently are on refugee resettlement in North America and Europe, on environmentally induced displacement worldwide, on food security and sovereignty in diverse communities and in cities of the Global South. So with that, I welcome Pablo to give today's lecture. You can go for about, you can go for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have questions after.
Awesome.
Yeah, I will.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. And a big thanks to Bipasha and others for organizing and inviting me to give this talk. I'm realizing I have a very lengthy title, and really, mainly, I'm just going to be talking about climate migration today. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this series. I know that Bipasha gave the talk last week, and the first speaker in this series, Anna Zalek, and I also partnered leading the environmentally displaced section of the Refugee Resettlement Network. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today builds on this kind of work on environmental displacement and environmental migration or climate migration. Anna, myself, and Elizabeth Lundstrom, who's now at Boise State, co-led this effort to try and understand this one particular facet of displacement in the world today. How is it that people get displaced as a result of environmental factors? I'll talk about some of the other factors as well today, but this kind of framework of environmental displacement comes out of work that we've been doing now for almost 30 years. As Bipasha mentioned, I am a, excuse me, I have a bad cough, and I will apologize for that. It's not COVID, but it is a bad cough. As Bipasha mentioned, I'm an urban geographer and a migration studies scholar, and there's really two sides to the work that I do. One side has been looking at the displacement of people all across the world for a number of different reasons, including climate and environmental reasons. And the other side of my work really looks at resettlement for that very, very small number of people who actually get resettled into third countries like the US and Canada and a number of European countries. What kind of happens to them? Last weekend, for example, I was interviewing Eritreans, Congolese, Afghan, and Venezuelans who'd been resettled in these small towns in Vermont, kind of like this one here, actually that one there. And so I do a lot of that work on resettlement, but today I'll be talking about the other side of this story, which is the displacement of people. So I'm going to start today by talking a little bit about climate migration, what's going on with the displacement of people as a result of climate change in particular. I'm going to situate that within the broader story of global displacements that are happening across the world today. I'm going to then turn to talk about how we should really be thinking about both the displacement that's happening and what are the kind of interventions, the thinking about what do we do about this kind of displacement. And I'll end by talking about this effort that I'm involved with right now, which seeks to understand both what's happening right now and what might happen in the future. So it's really talking about how do we understand what is and what might happen with climate change and migration. So to begin with, climate migration is something, oh yeah, that would be awesome. Climate migration is something that is very much, thank you, top of mind today. And we see it as more and more of these different kinds of environmental catastrophes kind of unfold around us. And so we've become not inured, I hope, but more and more accustomed to seeing scenes like this. The town of Paradise, California, engulfed in flames. Lytton, engulfed in flames. Jasper, engulfed in flames. Not just in North America, but we see this throughout the world. So this is Greece, wildfires in Greece, wildfires in Australia. And these kinds of scenes of destruction raise all kinds of questions and all kinds of concerns, not just about these communities as they struggle to survive and then perhaps rebuild, but which is the next place that's going to get hit. And of course, it's not just wildfires. These are scenes from Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria before and after. Houston, as it was flooded by Hurricane Harvey. Florida just got hit with successive hurricanes, Milton and the hurricane before it, and left different parts of the state underwater. Parts of Central Europe. This was just a couple of weeks ago in the central mountains, the eastern mountain, well, rather the western mountains of North Carolina, a place that was seen for many years as being a climate haven. You can get away to North Carolina because you're not close to the coasts, right? And yet even these kinds of places engulfed by floodwaters. This is a photo from last summer from the capital city of the state that I live in, Vermont. Another place that was considered and has been considered as a climate haven. As a result of the pandemic, from 2020 to 2023, there was the largest influx of people into Vermont since the 1970s. In the 1970s, that influx was so-called back to the landers. In 2020 to 2023, it was people coming because the state was seen as protected against not only pandemics, but also from climate change. And then we see floods like this. Not just happening in 2023, there had been a flood that had happened in 2011, and then again this year. So instead of a 100-year flood, you're having floods every 10 years, every 2 years. And of course, those are just the kind of climate change effects that are seen as catastrophic, that are happening right now. But there are longer-term changes to the land that we see in all different parts of the world. Deforestation, droughts, the loss of arable land due to other reasons as well. And so whether from short or long-term reasons, the climate is changing and the livability on the land itself is changing as well. What do people do in the face of this kind of change? And we see this more and more. This is Floridians interviewed just a few days ago, excuse me, after facing the second in the series of destructive hurricanes. I talk about moving daily. Florida residents weigh whether to leave after destructive storms. After Helene and Milton, residents of Casey Key question its future. Some of that is also related to the underlying structure of places like Florida. Many people who live in precarious conditions, mobile homes built in areas that are especially vulnerable. But these are questions that are becoming more and more omnipresent. It's very, very hard now to get any kind of flood insurance in a place like Florida. So this question, are people going to rebuild? Are they going to come back to where they already are and have been? Or are they going to move? And if they're going to move, where are they going to move? These kinds of questions have become more and more significant. I was looking at the messages that I have waiting for me at home. I have 3 requests from reporters asking about climate migrants, because we have both the question of whether or not people are going to return to where they have been, but there are other places that are asking, are people coming here? Who's coming here? That's been an interesting part of the dynamic I've seen in Vermont, where for several years now, I have been fielding questions from cities, small little towns, their select boards saying, when can we expect the climate migrants? Where are they coming from? How many climate refugees might there be? And I've often been sort of struck by this question, thinking, why do you think climate migrants are going to come here? Now, in places like North Carolina, places like Asheville in North Carolina has marketed itself as a climate haven. So that's where part of this kind of discourse has been coming from. But are people actually moving? Have they already moved? Will they move? In lots of places, islands in the South Pacific, this notion of simply being able to move, making that choice to find some other kind of shelter is an entirely different one. And so these are questions that, that folks in many parts of the world have been asking for a while. And one of the questions that we kind of struggle with is whether or not this type of move is already underway in places where you can make a move like that. I will say that in, again, returning to Vermont, this is the field that my wife runs a refugee agriculture program, and this is one of 2 farm sites. There are farm sites on either side of a river, 6 acres on one side, 10 acres on the other. That river usually runs at about 3 feet. When the floods happened last year, in 2023, the river crested at 27 feet. This year, and that was on the heels of a hurricane that had come through. This year, they had come back in. It was supposed to be, they've been working on this climate resilient farming, trying all sorts of different techniques. The fields flooded again. They didn't flood quite as much. But at their crest, it was about 17 feet. And so the farmers asked again, should we come back here? Does it make sense to grow here again? Now, of course, it does make sense to. There are reasons that you grow in a floodplain. It's much more fertile soil. But for many of these folks, that question comes up again and again, and that sense that this, like the Western Mountains of North Carolina, is a climate haven is really starting to erode. That notion that there is anywhere that you can get away from the effects of climate change is really starting to erode. As I said, this question of climate migration needs to be contextualized within this broader framework of global displacement. I'm going to come back to climate change and displacement, but again, let me talk about that bigger picture. There's really 3 major ways in which we tend to understand people being displaced from their homes, from their livelihoods, from sometimes their nations, certainly their neighborhoods, their communities. And it's these 3 particular forms. One is as a result of conflict or persecution. Wars, being persecuted on the basis of your identity, your race, your religion, nationality, ethnicity, etc. A second is development. The building of a dam, the building of a road, urbanization, things like that. And the third is different kinds of environmental change. We only recognize one of those different types. We only recognize, as a matter of international law, conflict and persecution. We don't recognize development-induced displaced people, and we don't really recognize those displaced as a result of environment. Right? People use terms like environmental refugee, climate refugee, but that's not a protected category in terms of international law. In a very limited sense, you can sometimes get temporary protection, but that temporary protection, again, is temporary. So when we see figures like this, these widely quoted figures of the number of people who have been displaced, who are considered displaced by the UN and by the international community, these are incredibly alarming numbers, right? Just about 15 years ago, the UN recognized just under 35 million people as displaced across the world. Today, it's more than 100 million, right? Incredibly alarming numbers. But again, that does not count anyone who has been displaced as a result of climate change. To some degree, again, with temporary displacements, we see some people recognized, but the vast majority of these are conflict-induced displacees. So again, when we see figures like this, it undercounts the scale of the problem. And of course, even those who have been displaced now have caused a greater and rising backlash all across the world. Arguably, the biggest factor behind the rise of the extreme right in different parts of the world, the move to the center of political power of so much of the right, has been this backlash against not just immigrants, not just migrants, but specifically refugees. You know, the refugee has become this kind of category of fear and loathing. In the US, for example, the US at one point was one of the largest participants in the global refugee system. Under the Trump administration, successive cuts to the refugee program meant that by 2020, it was at its lowest point. Under Biden, the number who are supposed to be accepted has risen, but because of the nature of the cuts to the program, the US program hasn't really had the capacity to kind of relocate people. And depending on what happens in a couple of weeks, there may not be a refugee program at all. And so this is the kind of backdrop that we have rising number of people who are being displaced, but even when it comes to those groups who are recognized as refugees, we have less and less capacity to actually resettle. So how then to approach this question of climate displacement? If we do have this kind of litany of catastrophes and we start to think about, well, where is it that people can go? How do we actually start to think about what resilience might mean in this context? So here I want to talk about the idea of nexus dynamics. And nexus dynamics really makes the argument that you cannot begin to understand something like climate change impacts and migration without understanding the underlying story of what is going on. It's often said that when you look at something like a, quote, natural disaster, that natural disaster has underneath that fire, underneath that flood, underneath that hurricane, the landslide, the tornado, an entire history and a genealogy of a different set of effects that might intensify the reasons that we see the kind of catastrophe unfold. When you look at Hurricane Katrina and what that did to New Orleans, was the story of Hurricane Katrina the story of a Category 5 hurricane that swept through this city? Was it a story of a nation state unprepared to deal with this kind of disaster? Those things may be true, but it was as much the story of generations of segregation, of racism, of police brutality in the city, of a deeply unequal urban landscape, of the effects of white flight from outside of the city, of city ordinances that structured people's access to space and resources in different kinds of ways. And that's very much a similar lens that we have to take when we look at something like the effects of climate change and the migration that may or may not be happening as a result of that. So when we look at, for example, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, it is that hurricane. It is the kind of geographical vulnerability, excuse me, that might be part of Puerto Rico's condition, but it's also the relation of Puerto Rico to the United States as this kind of colonial possession. It's the fact that Puerto Rico has this incredible debt crisis, has out-migration of its especially younger working population. It's all of these other kinds of things. The notion of nexus dynamics in a lot of ways seems self-evident, right? That of course you need to understand the broader context. It is not just a storm. And yet when we approach many of these kinds of issues, we don't tend to take that much more complicated view, the more complicated lens. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project where we tried to take this nexus dynamics framework and apply it specifically to the case of refugee camps, just to give a little bit of illustration of this. So this idea for this project came out of a very specific context, which was I was having a conversation with a couple of people I knew who were working in a refugee camp called Cox's Bazar. Cox's Bazar is a refugee camp in Bangladesh, which is today the largest refugee camp. Over 1 million people spread out across a number of different camp complexes. So I'm talking to this person who I've known for a while, and they're working in the camp. And this is in the late summer of 2020. And they were saying to me, you know, we have this situation where there is a threat of a super cyclone brewing up in the Bay of Bengal. We've had an outbreak of the first set of cases of COVID in the camp. We're approaching monsoon season, and you know, there's a factional infighting between different groups in the camp. Heavy rains are starting. We moved a bunch of the equipment up to the top of this particular camp building, and it got overrun by monkeys. So we can't access any of the equipment. You know, which of these different crises do I attend to first? How do I actually address this? So this precipitated a number of different conversations that we began to have within a group of researchers about how to address these kinds of multiple impacts at the same time. And so rather than just focusing on that kind of the spectacular image of the crisis at hand, we began to try and think about, well, how would, sorry, I'm realizing these are out of order. How would these different kinds of crises be managed in a place like a refugee camp? So again, thinking about this kind of broader picture of environmental displacement and looking at this particular issue, we wanted to complicate the question of the climate refugee by using the refugee camp itself. Thinking about the people who were in the camp as having themselves potentially been displaced by these kind of multiple factors, and then their life in the camp itself being complicated, again, by these multiple factors. So again, recognizing that environmental displacement itself isn't just because of one thing. So we had, as part of this broader project with Libby and Anna, excuse me, been looking at different ways in which climate, or rather environmental displacement might happen. It can happen because of climate change itself. It can happen because of attempts to adapt to climate change. So one of the things that I had found in some of the work I'd already been doing in Bangladesh was that in quite a few instances, the government of Bangladesh was displacing people from land, not because they were threatened by climate change, but because they thought that they could be threatened by climate change. So it was a preventative displacement to stop displacement, right? And the idea was it's going to be too difficult to try and deal with this down the road. Let's deal with it now. Others simply called it a land grab or a green grab. There are other forms of displacement, including the displacement as a result of conservation efforts. This is something I'll return to, thinking about the camp in Bangladesh, which abuts an elephant reserve on one side and a tree afforestation project on another. And then the one that I'll talk about here. So in thinking about these kind of different kinds of impacts and different factors, we started this project. This project, I'll tell you, was a complete flop. It did not work, and I will explain why it did not work. But what we started off with was trying to understand this overlapping set of challenges. In this case, what happens when you have public health crises hit a refugee camp, which itself is already kind of enmeshed in these different dynamics around politics and culture, and you combine that with environmental risks. What do we know about the vulnerabilities in the camps that are already there? And so this project set out to look at this across a range of different refugee camps. On the macro scale, we took the 25 largest refugee camps in the UNHCR system, in the UN system, and we proposed to look at those. And we understood that the camp itself has changed a lot over the years. Refugee camps really start out as this artifact of the Second World War. And the idea is people are going to be in a camp for a short amount of time, and then we're going to get them back home. They'll have the ability to return to their homes. The refugee camp itself will be in a rural area, perhaps. It'll certainly be in an area that's kind of peripheral. The land isn't necessarily great. But what we've seen over time is that these camps themselves have shifted. They're often not in rural locations, they're in urban locations, or the scale of them is so large that they themselves are basically a small city. In many cases, this idea of temporary shelter is simply not there anymore. It's a protracted situation. People have lived their whole lives in a camp. They've grown and they've been born and grown up in a camp. The Bhutanese community that I've worked with a fair amount, they were displaced from Bhutan in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and they were essentially stuck in those camps until eventually in 2008, the US and a number of other countries began to resettle them. And we see that with many other populations. And they've grown in size, right? Camps in the, late 1980s, early 1990s, they're still operating on that model that a camp is going to be maybe 5,000, 10,000, 15, 20,000 people. But the camps we started to look at were much, much larger than that. Cox's Bazar, as I said, is a series of camp complexes, over 1 million people, right? Rohingya refugees primarily in this camp. And again, if we look at the Rohingya themselves and we look at why it is that they were displaced, again, thinking about it from that lens of nexus dynamics, there are many different reasons. It is not simply that the Rohingya are an ethnic Muslim minority in Myanmar. There's also, if you look at Rakhine province that they're displaced from, Rakhine was hit with multiple cyclones, wiped out the rice production, rice cultivation in that area. There were many, many anti-government protests over the response of the democratic government at the time, the junta afterwards. The province was also kind of primed for a type of export-oriented agriculture, the building of a pipeline. There are multiple other things kind of going on. But this is the kind of the landscape. Enormous camps. Dadaab, another one of the camps that we looked at, over 200,000 people. Always under threat from the government to close down Dadaab. And then they get some more money from international donors. The camp remains open. The camp itself is essentially has become an important market town in different ways in that region. Zatari in Jordan, another, basically market town as it's developed. You see these kind of fantastical stories about, oh, they've got bakeries, they've got this and that, and there is essentially the functioning of a small city in many of these camp areas, though the question of governance is really open. Kinds of services are provided in, again, what is essentially a small city. So we took a number of these different camps and we looked at what the environmental vulnerabilities might be in each of these places. What we found is in many of these, they're very poorly recorded, poorly tracked, very inconsistent. We looked at things like earthquakes, landslides. Again, these were really tailored to each of the specific locations. The one that had the most data that we were able to access, collected, was Cox's Bazar itself. And Cox's Bazar is really interesting. It's the only one that we came across that had a regular meeting, especially during the monsoon season. They had different people in the camps, different NGOs would come together to assess the different kinds of risks that were being posed. And they also had these really interesting civil volunteer kind of brigades that they had put together. That was the most interesting by far. They assessed things like cyclone risk, landslide risk, and then we were also, at the time when we first started this project, the idea was to build a dashboard for them, collect all of these different kinds of data and overlay. Again, this is early days of COVID shutdowns. We were trying to do things like gather data on COVID cases, and then have these all in a very accessible dashboard tool for camp staff. All of this fell apart. Why did this fall apart? We, again, excuse me, we tried to ask that kind of broader question. In Cox's Bazar, we tried to be as open to the different factors at play. We tried to map those underlying vulnerabilities. Again, understanding what displacement meant for the different communities in the different camps. How do we prioritize the different kinds of vulnerabilities? What did we mean by protection? But the challenges were multiple. One of the challenges we came across was, so when COVID-19 first hit, there was this general sense that refugee camps would be devastated, right? We had already seen the way in which prison populations, for example, had high rates of infection. But that didn't happen. At least it didn't happen in those early waves. And the reason that it didn't happen was that access to camps was simply curtailed. And it wasn't the access of refugees to camps necessarily. That was also challenging. It was the access of international aid workers. They really cut the flow of people. And it's those aid workers who would have been the vectors for transmission. And so that access to the camp was denied to them, but it was also denied to us. So part of our project was to go to the camps, and we weren't able to do that. The much bigger issue that we had was the access to the data. So when we started the project, everybody was on board. Okay, we'll upload this data. We'll get, we had this all set up where the clinics were going to be providing data, the NGOs were going to be providing data, the local volunteer brigades, this is in Cox's Bazar, were going to provide data. But very quickly, it became clear that the domestic politics in Bangladesh meant that the party in power was not interested in bad news. And they were not interested in us publishing any data that was going to give a negative perception. And so that access we couldn't update in real time at all. So that access to data became a huge issue. The shifting environmental conditions themselves, as they changed in and around the camps, was a real challenge. Who do you work with in these camp environments? Getting into the camp was fairly straightforward. It was UNHCR and other kinds of, but once you get into the camp itself, it's an entirely different matter. I realize I'm focusing a lot on Cox's Bazar because that's the one that we work the most with. But the other thing that became very apparent was that there are a few Rohingya refugees who've been resettled. There are some, but the vast majority have not. And that's in part because countries like the US and its allies have, for the most part, paid Bangladesh to offshore refugees and keep them in Cox's Bazar. And that is a trend that we see kind of globally, that rather than resettlement, there really is a kind of a use of the camp space to hold on to people. So how does this all relate back to this idea of modeling migration? So again, to bring up that question that I started with, which is, where are people going to go? If we're having these kinds of crises, if we know the underlying challenges of a kind of a broader global displacement picture that isn't pretty, to say the least, how do we start to try and understand global climate migration? This is not obviously the first time we've started talking about this. There were a lot of discussions of not climate migration per se, but environmental refugees, environmental migration, especially in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And at the time, you had a lot of pretty wild numbers thrown around. It's going to be 1 billion people, 2 billion people, 3 billion people. What is that kind of based on? And the fact that the rationale for how we came up with these numbers was not always particularly convincing meant that alongside some of the other kind of geopolitical debates that were going on, the question of the environmental refugee really falls off the international radar for the better part of the 2000s. But in the last 10, 15 years, it's really been revived. Libby and I have given 3, 4 excuse me, presentations to the UNHCR saying, you have to deal with this particular issue. It's not going away. Capacity alone is not enough of a reason to say that, that we aren't going to deal with the question of the environmental refugee. So how in the past was this kind of modeled? Really in a very static kind of fashion. Researchers would take the population of a given area, and then they would say, well, what would it look like if there was a 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter sea level rise? But of course, that doesn't account for the dynamism that exists. People aren't simply going to stay there as sea levels rise. There have been other interesting efforts. I realize this isn't reproducing particularly well, but after Hurricane Katrina, for example, New Orleans was a city that was a historically Black city. After Hurricane Katrina, it is a much whiter, much more Latino, and much less Black city. And one of the things that researchers have done has been to look at excuse me, where the Black population of Katrina, of New Orleans went after Katrina and how many people actually returned. And so looking at the effect of things like this, Puerto Rico is another one where people have looked at where the population has gone, how much of it has returned after Hurricane Maria. So there's been some work done like that. In Bangladesh, there's actually been some really interesting household level surveys that have been done of populations who have moved as a result of different kinds of climate events. It's really challenging in a place like Bangladesh to distinguish between whether or not people are moving as a result of a catastrophic event or if it overlaps with seasonal migration. Because again, in a place like Bangladesh, seasonal migration is not a new trend. But still, there's some really interesting household level work that's been done, asking people why they went where they have gone, how long they'll stay there, and what kind of precipitated their decision. So there's some interesting stuff there. The UN's climate change refugee map, again, lays out mostly places where They see people being potentially displaced from. Where they predict them to go is itself very, very interesting. A lot of it is, regional, as one might imagine, Australia being one of the really key areas. So this, I'll end with, is really this kind of project that I'm engaged in right now, which is trying to use this kind of more dynamic set of factors to try and understand what is happening now and what might happen into the future. So taking into consideration these different kinds of things, environmental degradation more broadly, climate-related natural disasters, which might accelerate those kinds of impacts, but also these other factors, the political factors, economic ones, lack of access to resources and land, and really try and understand what it is that people may do in the face of climate change. So we've tried to bring together 3 different sets of partners. One is social scientists who have worked or are working on the different ways in which climate change has effects on different populations. And so one that is looking at the direct kinds of effects that climate change might have. A second is looking at adaptations. Adaptations, attempts to mitigate, what do those look like? And put us in conversation with different policymakers and practitioners. So people who are dealing with this on the ground, in the UN, at the national level, at the local level as well. And then finally, drawing on the tools of data science to aid in trying to bring all of these factors together and to create more robust ways of trying to predict where it is that people may go. Some of the things that we have been working with, excuse me, draw on other attempts more recently to understand other kind of large-scale movements. For example, the question of how many people actually moved during the height of the pandemic. Where did they go? Did they stay? Did they come back? I said the thing about Vermont. Vermont was very excited that so many people had shown up as a result of the pandemic, its first population growth in decades. But most of those people didn't actually stay, right? And there were second home owners. There were people who were able to work from home. But when those conditions changed, they didn't actually stay. So understanding those kinds of questions, what are the key drivers of climate migration? What is it that, why are people actually moving? Who has the ability to move, right? This notion that people will simply be on the move because they're under threat is not really consonant with the fact that not all people are able to move. People don't simply refuse to leave a Florida or a, or Puerto Rico because they are stubborn. They don't believe in climate change. There are all sorts of other reasons. I know I keep returning to the example of Hurricane Katrina, but for so many people, the reason that they did not leave New Orleans was because they could not leave New Orleans. There were some people who did not wish to, but for many people, there was no transportation. There was nowhere to go, right? Again, thinking about places to go. When we see the kind of voluntary migrations that are already happening in Canada or in the US, what percentage of the population is able to make the choice to actually move to another place? It's a relatively small number of people who are able to make that change and be able to access the resources to do that. How do we distinguish between these kinds of seasonal or regular migrations, the adaptation efforts that people make, and the catastrophes that leave them with few, if any, choices? So in what ways do these different factors, both displacing and reactive, how do they interact to produce movements? We certainly don't have really good data, even on secondary migration, as it is in places like the US. There's very little current tracking of where people go and how long they stay there. So much of this is still very much a work in progress. So I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Sure. All right, Eric.
Thank you for this great talk. It was fascinating. And my question is going to sound maybe cynical, but it's not. It's just so there's early in the talk you mentioned that there's no kind of proper recognition of climate refugees. But so do we need one? So people will move for all kind of reasons. They will become refugees for all kind of reasons. What we need is institutions that can help those people in the migrations, in their movement, and so on. But does it really matter that we identify them as climate refugees? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I would say in the short term, in terms of providing protection, right? It's always been protection and the granting of the kind of legitimacy of any refugee is always in the eye of the power, right? The reason that my family in 1946 are allowed to be seen as refugees from what is now Bangladesh to India, but anyone who came after 1946 is an economic migrant, is all about the power of the state to recognize one versus another. So I think you're quite right that regardless of the kind of the framing, there is still an underlying problem. And the underlying problem is actually much deeper than simply whether or not we recognize one category versus another. The reason that or the shorthand reason as to why we recognize conflict or persecution-based refugees versus others is because one can ascribe intentionality in the first case, right? You can say, yes, I have a legitimate claim because X group is persecuting me. And in the case of environmental refugees or climate refugees, who has acted against you, right? And so that's a much deeper problem, that if the people of Tuvalu or the South Pacific lodge a case in the International Criminal Court and say that we are being displaced from our land, or Bangladesh is a perfect example. Bangladesh produces 0.05% of the carbon emissions in the world, and yet will face a hugely disproportionate displacement effect, right? But making that case about the intentionality of the US, for example, as the greatest contributor is much more difficult. So that's a deeper underlying problem that is more of a problem with the refugee system that we have than anything else. So you're right that, as some people have said, to argue about whether or not environmental refugee is a legitimate category, is perhaps missing the point altogether. And I think that that's a valid critique. The question then becomes, so what is it? We've already seen the kind of the ways in which right-wing politics continues to demonize all refugees. One of the things I often feel when talking about the people who are dealing with the crises is the kind of revanchist attitude of like, well, you put yourself in harm's way. Or the thing I was saying about the farmers, right? Where, well, why are they farming there? They know they're going to. Why are these people in Florida living in Florida? There's other reasons you can question why you want to live in Florida, but it's the kind of the blaming the victim idea, and I think that this has become more and more prevalent. It's not really answering your question, but I think, yeah.
Thank you.
Kind of a follow-up on that. Presumably, as these climate disasters displace people from land and access to resources to which they formerly had access to, conflicts will start increasing as well. So to what degree do these two problems start dovetailing maybe to the point where these categories are maybe less important. We've got, I guess that's your nexus idea, these interacting causes for displacement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that already happens, right? And again, the Rohingya example is one in which you've had that series of overlapping hurricanes, lack of access to land, redefinitions of who should have access to land. After the tsunami in Southeast Asia, take a place like Sri Lanka, and the way in the rebuilding of Sri Lanka directly put groups into competition, in some cases who hadn't been in competition before. It does become an interlocking set of factors. At the same time, I want to be careful about not being kind of environmentally deterministic, that it is as a result of, we're going to have water wars, or, but I do think that it is really challenging. How do you go about, because the effect on the person may be very similar, right? The person, I mean, we see this now in a different set of categories. In the US, there's a very clear legal distinction between an asylum seeker and a refugee. Why? The only thing that is different is the point at which you are making the claim, right? The reason that you're making the claim might be very similar, it might be different as well. But it's that kind of categorizing as one is legitimate and the other is not. And one of the things I really struggle with in the US is in making a defense of the refugee that doesn't discredit a different migrant group. So I think it's a very challenging context here.
I may have missed something in the beginning, and that's a lot of information to. It's okay. I'll speak loud. Oh, sorry. Okay. I guess, as I said, I may have missed something in the beginning of your presentation. I'm just wondering, is there an international organization, perhaps that you are a member of, that is looking at, I don't know, solutions, possible places, where in the world can we build? Obviously, the flooding and some of the displacement, flooding is one of the problems, obviously proximity to oceans and floodable rivers, etc. Are we looking at places where we can settle mass numbers of people? And if not, why not? I mean, apparently China has cities that were built for millions and nobody's moved there. I mean, can we do that as a global society? Say, look, this is happening. What are we going to do? Where can we go?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Again, when we look at the places that we've thought of as climate havens, the rate and scale at which climate change is happening really call that into question. Yeah, I grew up in Vancouver, where what was the big fear that we had? It was always earthquakes. Yeah. And when I was growing up, there was never a building that was above a certain height.
Sure.
But by the 1990s, people were like, it hasn't happened yet. Oh. And boom, up they went, right? And so there is a bit of this kind of like risk-taking but to your other question about whether or not there are organizations or efforts to try and look at different things. I mean, in terms of migration more broadly, there had been a long-term multilateral effort called the Global Compact on Migration that was really trying to remove incentives for things like human trafficking, allow for a more regulated movement of people. There had been efforts like this, and there have been other efforts at looking at, well, what would mass migration look like? The problem is those have either been undermined or undercut by like right-wing conspiracy theories, autocratic governments who want, and so it's been a real back and forth. But it's definitely true that there have been efforts to kind of look at what this might look like. There is unused land in some places, but for the most part, I mean, I know I keep going back to Bangladesh as an example. When you look at a place like Bangladesh and people are moving out of some of the more vulnerable areas, for long-term moves, they're moving to a city like Dhaka. But when they're moving to a city like Dhaka, where are they going? There are places in Dhaka that are very affluent, but the vast majority of Dhaka that is growing are slum areas,
Sure.
right? And that's where they're going. And so that's a real challenge as well.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, it needs to be sort of comprehensive. If you're going to resettle a whole group of people, you need to have them be in a place where, for example, they can grow their own food, et cetera. You know, I mean, sort of a sustainable eco city.
The Maldives at one point, now this is a former prime minister of the Maldives who would do things like hold city council meetings underwater. You know, you've seen these famous pictures. But he also at one point, I think he was overthrown, but there was a coup at one point, but he took a portion of the sales tax from tourism. Maldives has a pretty healthy tourist economy. And he openly said that he was going to buy land in Australia to move the population of the Maldives once Australia didn't take kindly to that. But yeah, this is the question of like, if we're not talking about individual movement, if we're talking about mass movement, right? And this is what animates part of the kind of the populist right is what if a mass of people show up? So
Sure. Well, they're going to need to go somewhere if they survive.
right.
Did you?
Thanks for everything. This was great. So I have a sort of more abstract question. I hope that's okay. So I think there have been a variety of disciplines that at some point have come to the conclusion that thinking about one thing at a time isn't going to cut it. Another example in social sciences is intersectionality as a theory. If you look at public health practice and kind of more in the policy space, people talk about systems thinking. Yeah. You mentioned this idea of nexus. What was the other word that goes with nexus?
Dynamics.
Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about this nexus dynamics idea? Did it exist when you were doing your PhD? Like when did this kind of come up and people were like, man, thinking about one thing at a time is not explaining what's going on very well?
I mean, and that's part of the reason that I was like, well, this isn't profound. The idea of like thinking about more things than, yeah. So the reason that I used nexus dynamics, or we used nexus dynamics, again, the folks that I was working with on this particular project were from ecology and public health. And in public health, the nexus dynamics, and again, partly in making this comprehensible to the UNHCR audience, nexus dynamics, and they also use, the WASH stuff, which I always found really interesting because the UN system uses this thing where this is the most interdisciplinary. It's like water, sanitation, and what's the H? Hygiene, right? They're like, that is everything. And I'm like, okay, that's some things, yeah. Right? But it was their way of saying, well, you have to, because there were discrete departments that dealt with different things. And they're like, we're going to have a meeting of everybody. And I'm like, there are a lot of things that are left out of water, sanitation, and hygiene. But yeah, I mean, part of this is I will say I feel that in disciplines anyway. I'm not a geographer by training. And when I joined geography, they were like, this is brand new. And I'm like, really? No, it's really not. But so I think some of it is it's semantics to some degree. So I am not going to ride really hard for nexus dynamics, even though I talked about it a lot.
Sorry.
But I think the underlying idea still is that simply ascribing, and I guess perhaps this is because I see it so often in the refugee world, is there is a tendency to favor the big story and the simple explanation. And I think that is such a disservice to the people who are experiencing this and in thinking about what interventions might be. I realized I painted an extremely depressing story here, and almost all the work I do is very much based on, okay, so how do we do something with this? Working in refugee resettlement under the Trump administration, no, I didn't work under the Trump administration, but I mean context of a Trump administration is deeply dispiriting. But it's not, you know, I mean, whatever, you still do it, right? You still have to make sense of this. And it's, you know, amazing to me what people actually manage to still do. You know, seeing the devastation of these floods that happen in Vermont, that just happen in North Carolina, South Carolina, places like that, you sit there and you think at the same time, it is amazing how these people come together to recover and protect one another. And at the same time, you think it is amazing how this incredibly wealthy country lets their people down. And so it is, yeah, it's kind of stunning in so many ways to see those things. Mhm. No.
Thank you. It seems to me too that the amount of people like crowding, like a place like Bangladesh, I don't know the population, but it's probably in the hundreds of millions of people who are vulnerable, and also they're quite poor. Where, you know, a person in North Carolina with a big mansion that gets ruined, it's probably worth like 10 million or so, a colossal amount of money, but you know, that can be fixed. They have insurance. I just think it's the scale of the problem. So I don't know if the nexus dynamics really, I'm not making much sense, I'm sorry, but it's like in the Trump era, as you said, it's like, well, those people are poor and there's just so many of them, let's just ignore it. We'll bury our head in the sand and maybe the problem will go away, or they can just suffer.
I mean, interestingly, I would say that where you see the worst damage in a place like North Carolina is also very much in poor communities, right? That this is parts of Appalachia that are being, you know, that are ignored in other kinds of ways, right? And so I think you're right. The scale of the issue, the number of people who are, and I think that's part of what we're interested in looking at as well, is like, how many people are vulnerable? How do we think about the particular issues at stake? And so that is very true. I do think that the idea even of insurance, like there may not be an insurer left in Florida after this. And so it's really a challenge. Yeah.
I totally agree with all the work on defining the problem. But in parallel to that, was there any good system of disseminating this information and in parallel work to start the problems?
In terms of disseminating how one responds to climate migration or kind of thinking about preparing?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, again, one of the challenges becomes in an age of disinformation, right? How do you know, one of the things that FEMA has many problems. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management System in the US. It has many, many problems. But it had to deal also with misinformation about FEMA to the point where some guy was making threats, and so that's actually been a real issue in getting people to understand. I mean, it's not just defining the problem, but really laying out what is going on. The fact that there are still people who will say, well, climate change is a hoax. There are people who are, maybe going to be president again who came out after this saying climate change is a hoax. That's a real challenge. If you cannot get people to accept kind of basic truths, it is a challenge. So, but at the same time, I would say certainly, certainly you have a younger generation that is, I think, much more attuned to the reality of climate change in a way in which many others, either with vested interests or not, are less willing to. So I do see some hope in that.
Based on all of that, is there any hope of a global solution to this, or does it have to be all specialized for the area?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it is, I do think that, yeah, I don't know. I think that we have seen successful attempts at global solutions in limited scope. I don't know. Yeah, I have no answer to that, unfortunately.
I expected that.
Right.
Anybody else?
Well, thank you so much. I really do enjoyed your presentation, and I learned quite a lot of things there. Talking about solutions, my research is looking at nature-based solutions, and I think globally, everyone has something to offer at your own level. Like what I am looking at is from the local level, we act locally, but with global impact. So I think if people at different places can adopt the strategy of acting locally at any point in time, and in the long term, we can realize this global impact. So that can also be a way of how we can approach these climate refugees, conservation refugees, and all of those stuff. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So my question has to do with where do you draw the line between like environmental like refugees and like climate refugees? Hello? Okay, sorry. So my question is that where do you draw the line between who is an environmental like refugee and like a climate refugee? Because the two has, like there's all like some blurry lines. So I'm just curious, like in your life, your readings and like the many works that like you've done, can we put the two together? Can we separate it? Like how does the two like impact maybe like policy, and how like we react to like the issue of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that climate refugee generally, the way we've used it has been as a subset of environmental refugee. We tend to see excuse me. We tend to see climate refugee used more than environmental refugee now. I think just because there is more awareness of climate change, or at least we talk about it more. So I think it has more power than saying environmental refugee per se now. But I think that, generally it's a subset of environmental refugee, climate refugee. And it tends to refer more specifically to people displaced as a result of climate change, even though, as we've said, these are overlapping in many ways. Yeah.
Just a quick technical question. You said in the middle of the talk that initial efforts to estimate the number of refugees we might be talking about over the years failed because we didn't have the right techniques. Do we have them now? And if so, what are they telling us?
No.
Okay.
And that's what part of this effort is really to try. And I mean, there's been some interesting work that's been done by the World Bank UN Center on Internal and International Displacement, which is based in Norway. And they've tried to, and part of this is a data issue, right? How much do you believe or trust the figures that are provided to you by different nation states? And it tries to calculate different forms of migration. And so that's one of the ways in which they've kind of looked at it and overlaid that with different kind of climate effects. Most of the accurate ones I've seen have tended to be at such a small scale that they're difficult to then extrapolate more widely. So for example, we worked with, in a different project, Mongolian goat herds. And we were looking at the impact, but this at a very small scale. We were working with, 350 people. And we were having them create maps of where they were taking their goat herds on the basis of available watering holes and this and that. It was really interesting, rich work, but it was working with 4 cooperatives in Mongolia, right? How do you start to, and then when we tried to get the other data, we could, so part of it is a data issue. I think we do a good job of tracking at a small scale. It's much harder to start to look at that at a larger scale, but that's part of what we're hoping to do.
Climate change, as far as I hear most times, is largely a result of our carbon use. Is that the sort of general understanding?
Generally, yeah.
Although I don't know, have you folks ever heard of Project Drawdown? I think it's out of the States. I can't remember one name right now, but it was a group of hundreds of scientists, and they created a like an impact scale. And according to that, now this is 5 years ago, I'm pretty sure, when I first encountered it, carbon dioxide emissions were way down the scale. One of the biggest contributors was actually coolants, refrigerants. And I'm assuming that's because of the nature of the molecule and how much it traps. And so, I mean, I just think it's interesting that that's not a part of large conversations that you hear in the news. All you ever hear about is petroleum and carbon dioxide emissions and cows and whatever. Anyway, I just thought, like you said, in the world of misinformation, I mean, I don't know if what they're saying is true, but I've never heard that. So anywhere else, like I've never heard it coming from a government organization that, although, I mean, obviously we've changed coolants in our refrigerants. Anyway, it's just these things are rolling in my head thinking, well, if that's the big deal, then, we need to be insulating our things better, right? So we're not using coolants like we are and sort of changing our expectations. But one of the big factors is if that's true, I mean, I just think we should be insulating our houses.
But I think one of the challenges, again, is that when you're dealing with a multifaceted system,
sure,
the story that came out yesterday I saw was that the Earth's, excuse me, natural sinks did not capture, an adequate, I think it was a net negative in terms of the carbon sink capture. That's something that contemporary modeling doesn't account for, right? And it is not clear what is happening that is long-term and that is, just happening right now. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't know. Going back to that question of like the initial round of modeling and why it ended up becoming, and it wasn't really modeling per se, it was simply estimates. And it became discredited because it wasn't credible, right? To simply say that, well, this is going to, it wasn't that, a 1 to 2 to 3 meter sea level rise wouldn't have impacts. It's that there's all kinds of things that we do in response to that. In the same way that there are things that we do in response to what's happening right now. So, yeah, I mean, I am very curious to see, our first couple of meetings that we've had have been very interesting because you have social scientists who are dealing with the on-the-ground impacts in many ways of communities, food security change, all sorts of different issues. And you have data scientists who, are looking for different kinds of things to input into these models. And so I'm hoping by this time next year, there will be more there'll be more to actually present on what we've come up with. So.
Yeah, I just have one more thought, and this gentleman was mentioning local solutions, and something that I'd been involved in thinking about for years. I was a part of a group that was, talking about eco-villages and appropriate technologies and alternative technology, and still I see so little movement, especially in Canada. In Europe, I've seen reference to groups that are looking at, for example, on it would impact the environment, the environmental devastation that we are sort of responsible for, but it obviously would have an impact on the climate change aspect if we simply looked at changing how we build, what we build with. You know, hemp, for example. You know, there's lots of studies to suggest that if we grew, there's one fellow in Toronto who's talking about, you know, if we grew, I forget, it was 20 million acres of hemp, and like all the products you can get from that. And I just think, oh, come on, people, let's do this already. You know, I mean, you've got fuel and fiber and food, and it's like, it's just so slow.
I mean, we have seen human societies and cultures change in the face of ecological catastrophe in the past. You know, it's the scale and the global nature of it at this point, which makes it a different kind of challenge.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I actually have several questions,
Yeah.
but I just kind of wonder, on the face of it, I want to say, yeah, it's a great thing to recognize climate threats as being a reason why people need to move. I wonder what the downsides of that are. And I often think of, if it is, how high will the burden of proof be to prove that, right? And I say this because, like, I've been hearing these cases of, well, obviously Bangladesh and Myanmar, for example, you know, and Sudan, another example, South Sudan, and where often what they're doing now, it's not because they don't understand, often, say at IOM, anywhere else, but they don't understand that there's a whole history we need to consider, right? How did South Sudan and Sudan, like, what's the whole historic relationship? But they try to find, as you said, who harmed you?
Yeah.
That's easier, right? So some of the things that emerge from that, like, produce their own violence, though. As an example, one of the things I've been hearing a lot is, it's much easier to say, if you're in Dadaab, like if you're in a camp in anywhere so for example, in South Sudan, you can say it's much easier to claim, for example, for women, that you were raped by a Janjaweed. You know, the whole idea of like the Arab terrorist. I mean, like, it performs its own violence, right? Like, so the idea that Black African women are now being raped by, and that's why their case deserves hearing. So I understand why it's done. You see what I mean? But I kind of wonder about, because each case is so different in terms of migration, right? So would recognizing it as a valid reason for people wanting to migrate, are there other things we need to think about along the way?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that, you know, that's an interesting example, because one of the arguments for recognizing climate change effects is that it would allow you to make a group-based assessment, as opposed to, because the problem in asylum, for example, is that you have to make an individual argument, right?
Yeah.
It's still, I mean, I think it still comes back to the fundamental underlying problem, which is the refugee system itself.
Absolutely.
So, because if you have people who are in need of shelter, sanctuary, assistance, whatever it is this the best way to do it? I mean, that's the much broader problem. If you have masses of people who are going to be in harm's way, how do you recognize that there's a global obligation to them? I think that's the broader underlying issue.
And without then also pawning off the responsibility to a country that might be just as, like, you think about the whole case with the Rohingyas, right? So the way people go on about, oh, it's horrible that in Bangladesh, Rohingya children can't learn Bengali. Of course, they're doing it on purpose. They don't want them to assimilate because they have so many problems of their own, right? So I think about that a lot, because then it becomes about, we know this, right? We know that the vast majority of the world's climate migrants don't get to leave national boundaries. Like, they often have to be accommodated. And where they are, often it's like pitching people who, again, have contributed next to nothing to our issues, but they're often taking on the responsibility. So I always say Bangladesh has been extraordinarily generous, actually, considering that there's also conflict between the camps and the surrounding regions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, about like, why are you doing this? We need help. Why does this group of people get help, right? So,
no, absolutely. And I mean, not to, also the internal politics of Bangladesh, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
This story is as old as time. Your family was displaced in 1946 when the British divided up India and gave parts willy-nilly to people. My family in the 1836, because of a famine in Madeira, they became indentured workers with the British and went to the Caribbean. And then in 1962, when there was unrest in where I was living because of fear of communism and manipulation by the US and by Britain, we came here. So we're very good. This moving for climate because of famine, moving, potato famine. If you're Irish, your family may have some of that history, or moving because of political unrest and stuff, like your family and my family, is very common. In the world, we are very good at dividing ourselves into nations and talking about us belonging to nations and wanting to keep those other people out of where we are. That's why Trump's wall was so popular. Is there any hope for the human race that we could see ourselves as one nation, as a human race, not, we divide ourselves by religion, we divide ourselves by race, we divide ourselves by where we come from, we divide ourselves by gender. We have so many ways of dividing ourselves up. This is such a built-in human thing, though. Is there any hope of a world without borders? United Nations that's an effective global governance?
Yeah, that I certainly don't have an answer to. I will say, yeah, but I will say this, it's like, again, not to trivialize in any way the actual experience and the horrific experiences that people have, but I was thinking about this again, as I was meeting, 60-something different families, from all these different places. And I was doing all these interviews with my students, and we were kind of debriefing afterwards, and they were amazed by the people that they had met with and talked to. And I feel this all the time when I work with different populations as well. I can't imagine being displaced and having to rebuild my life in the way in which, and the stuff that people have lived through, and yet still rebuild and still, raise their kids and make a new life for themselves and make the place that they've come to a better place. And that is something that each time I meet with people, and again, I never want it to sound trivializing, that the fact that people undergo trauma and still make sense of their lives, that doesn't mean they wanted to go through that trauma. But that's what gives me hope. It is amazing to me to see the sort of the resilience of, kind of humans. That sounds very trite, but yeah, it is something that's one thing that gives me hope.
We should go. All right. Yes. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Pablo. Oh,
Thank
yeah,
you.
right. We're almost at time. So thanks very much.
Thank you.